Okay, so we're back for part three after some technical difficulties. Let's get into Brzezinski Wolfowitz because,
All right.
like we discussed briefly in the other one, there's many people who talk about the day-to-day stuff, but let's get into some of the theories and the more, you know, predictive analysis.
Yeah, so we went over the two primary trends of technology and population growth over time, the two secondary trends of jobs moving south and people moving north, and the declining global wage labor equilibrium rate. So now we're going to go into what the um, what the strategy of the Anglosphere has been over the past couple hundred years. So this is moving into geostrategic theory. In this case, the British have always been trying to block in the ports of St. Petersburg and in Crimea since the 1700s, since Peter the Great and Catherine the Great. If you go down a couple of slides and get to, go ahead and go down to the map on the end. Okay, I'll talk about that stuff later. Go down to, no, the other map. It should be right at the very end of it.
Oh, right at the end, let me.
Yeah,
Oh,
we'll talk about the map real quick.
is it this? Oh
Yeah,
no.
that one. Okay. Yeah, the Mackinder map. Yeah, that one. All right. Yeah, a map like this is good to look at. So ever since ever since the 1700s and Peter the Great built St. Petersburg, the British has always been trying to has always been playing their sea power advantages against the land powers. So they tried to block in the Russians at St. Petersburg so they couldn't freely export and trade with the Hanseatic Leagues countries, or at least what I'm calling the Hanseatic League countries, of trading along the Baltics. So yeah, back in those days, you had East Prussia and Königsborg, and yeah, that whole area. And they had developed a lot of trade going up and down the rivers from the Baltic Sea into Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the Black Sea area, you have Crimea. The Russians moved into there in 1783 with Catherine the Great. They've actually moved down there even in the ninth or even in the 10th century. King Rurik was in Crimea also. So they've always been going up and down the Dnieper River and the Volga and Don rivers into the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. The Russians have.
Yeah.
So they've been doing that for a while, but they took control of it in 1783 and started putting their Black Sea fleet there, and they've been there ever since. The British and the French during the Crimean Wars during the 1830s tried to take it over. So there's always been conflict in that area of trying to deny Russia a warm water port.
Mm-hmm.
The reason why that area has always been so crucial is because most of the rivers in Russia flow into the Arctic Ocean. They flow north. So those are frozen, especially back in the old sailing ship era. Yeah, that was impossible to navigate because an iceberg is just going to sink a wooden boat.
Yep.
So the Russians have always been hemmed in. They can't export through most of the rivers. They've only got two southward flowing rivers. The Volga River flows into the Caspian Sea, which is
Mm-hmm.
landlocked.
Yep.
So they dug a canal in Volgograd over to connect it to the Don River, which does
Mm-hmm.
flow to Rostov on Don inside the Azov Sea. So it really comes down to one single river, the Don River, where almost, I mean, I don't know, like 80% of Russia's agricultural exports come out, and their mineral exports. So if you control Crimea and control the Azov Sea, you can shut off so much of Russia's economy, of their export shipping, because there is no country in the world where, as huge of a country that it is, all its exports come down to either St. Petersburg port or Rostov-on-Don or Vladivostok. Mm-hmm. And Vladivostok is hemmed in by the Japanese peninsula, where the number 5 is there.
Yeah.
By the Japanese island chain, I meant to say. So the British have always tried to control the areas that control Russia's 3 major ports. So that's the basis of the Great Game strategy. I think it was Hopkirk that wrote that book, I don't know, a few decades ago, about the Great Game, he was specifically talking about Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. So the Russians have always tried to get a warm water seaport, because you can flow down the Volga River to the Caspian Sea River, but then you would have to go overland to Iran or through Baluchistan. Baluchistan's now in Pakistan.
Yeah.
And get to the Indian Ocean. So ever since the late 1700s and during the 1800s, the Great Britain has always been trying to block the Russians from getting a seaport through Iran or Afghanistan and Baluchistan. So we just go back in history, because the conflict in Ukraine is nothing new. Putin's not crazy like the Washington Post keeps on saying every week. He didn't attack Ukraine for no reason. This is an ongoing game for 200 years. What's changed is technology, because Mackinder's original theory was that the sea powers have dominance because they can move around the periphery using the sea a lot easier than you could move cross country before there's a railroad. So then he changed his theory. His original theory was that sea powers have the advantage. Then during the 1930s and 40s, that started to change with the increase of, the Trans-Siberian Railroad, and then increased rail infrastructure, not only going east-west, but north and south. Mm-hmm. So the more railroad systems you had going east-west, north and south, different directions, the more Russia can connect with the other powers. Okay, this is a Russian-centric doctrine. The original 5-power center doctrine came from George Kennan and John Lewis Gaddis during the strategies of containment. And what that focused on was how you can keep Russia contained from integrating with the other power centers. Under the American-centric plan, North America was power center number 1 because it was the only up and running economy after World War II, because the United States bombed Germany's industrial powers and we bombed Japan's industrial center, so they need to be rebuilt. So we were the only functioning industrial centers. So we had to, during the Marshall Plan, we decided to rebuild Germany so they would have an economy that could support an army that could contain Russia. Not Russia, it was contain Soviet expansion. Same thing with Japan, rebuilt Japan so they would have an industrial center to try to stop the spread of communism in that part of Asia. So in that case, the United States is power center number 1, Western Europe would be power center number 2, and Japan and the Pacific Rim countries, including Korea and Taiwan, would be power center number 3. We're explaining this one into a 6-power center doctrine, where Russia becomes power center number 1, Western Europe becomes power center number 2, India, a newly industrialized country, becomes power center number 3. China has moved past the newly industrialized country stage into a major regional power, if not a superpower phase. And then Japan is an industrial center. So what's been occurring since the collapse of the Soviet Union is the new Russian Federation has been doing joint ventures with the Western petroleum companies and have built up their oil and gas extraction businesses and gone down the learning curve on that, where they can do a lot more of it themselves than they used to. And most importantly, they've been building pipeline infrastructure to the other power centers. So the Reagan administration had blown up one gas pipeline going from Russia into Western Europe because they didn't want the German world. I hate just to say Germany because it's not just Germany. The Switzerland and Austria were neutral countries. So building pipelines through Poland and Ukraine into Czechoslovakia, back then it was one country, and then and Hungary into Austria, also delivers cheap oil and gas to Switzerland. Back then it was the GDR, East Germany. Then once the government's connected, then it's one whole country. So then Germany becomes a huge industrial gas hub. So by building cheap oil and gas, it allows the whole German industrial world to consolidate. Getting into the purpose of NATO, the purpose of NATO is to keep the United States in Europe, to keep the age-old ethnic rivalries from rekindling and starting World War III. It's to keep the Germans down in Europe to prevent World War III. And it's meant to keep the Soviet Union out of Western Europe to prevent World War III. Well, after the Soviet Union fell and you get the Russian Federation, now Russia is getting access into Western Europe through their pipelines. So Russia's in Europe. It's building up the German world's industrial economies and actually integrating Germany with Russia, but also it's integrating Germany, the German-speaking part of Switzerland, Austria, and Liechtenstein. Okay, Liechtenstein's a small country, but they have Hilti tools. So
they're also a financial hub, if I'm not mistaken, like offshore.
It's a financial hub. Yeah, it's a financial hub. So they have more industry there than one would think.
Yep.
So that started to become worrisome of the geostrategic people of the United States. And that started creating a lot of friction because the Wolfowitz crowd focuses on geopolitical theory, where they don't want a new superpower forming between a combination of Russia and Germany. So you would have a resource-rich country integrating with a super advanced industrial economy. When I talk about advanced, you're talking about advanced in process technologies, in machine tools, and assembly line manufacturing centers. So you're marrying Henry Ford's production assembly line with advanced robotics and CNC machining, where you have high quality and you would have low cost production because of the cheap gas. If your energy prices increase, it increases the products of your prices. So they have advanced process technologies and advanced product technologies. By product technologies, I just mean they make really super great products. There's nothing better than German cars, nothing better than Swiss watches. and you can go right on down the list. So going from that, so they don't want a transfer of technology to go from Germany to Russia, where they become a combined superpower. And then also a lot of businesses then move into Poland and the other countries. So it would become one big economy. Under the Wolfowitz doctrine, that would become a superpower, and that would shift the global center of gravity in terms of politics from Washington and London. It would move the center of gravity from Berlin to Moscow. So they want to prevent that from happening. And yeah, if you transfer that same kind of reasoning from Russia to Iran to India, they don't want the international north-south trade corridor to go through, because if you integrate Russia with India, then again you're integrating a resource-rich country of Russia with India. Now has got every Silicon Valley company there. It's got all the German automakers there. It's got all the Japanese automakers and motorcycle manufacturers there. So then they would just be getting the same technology and the same trade and the same goods out of India that they could get from the other countries. Mm-hmm. So that becomes problematic. Then if you get into China, China has been building up the old Soviet railway system. Actually, if you can go back down to the map, it makes it easier for people to visualize. China has been integrating with Iran because Iran and Turkmenistan have tremendous amounts of Caspian Sea oil and natural gas. But Iran has Western sanctions and needs to escape Western sanctions. So they do ship through the Strait of Hormuz, but China is always afraid that, and Iran are afraid that they'll get cut off. Now, Turkmenistan is landlocked, so they can only trade with China. So China has been building oil and gas pipelines to Iran and Turkmenistan, as well as building up the highways and the railways of the old Soviet system. So China is integrating with the Central Asian stands. And if you integrate with pipeline and railway infrastructure to Iran, and Turkmenistan, you're also automatically including the other stands. Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. They also have oil and natural gas and lots of resources. And with the railway spur going from Uzbekistan to Mazar-e Sharif in Afghanistan, Afghanistan is also tremendously resource rich because they have a lot of rare earth metals that are really important. They have the other metals also. But if you can export all of those minerals onto the old Soviet system, that the railway system that the Chinese have drastically upgraded, well, now China has internal logistical supply routes to feed its industrial centers that cannot be interdicted by the U.S. Navy or British navies through the Straits of Hormuz or the Straits of Malacca or the Andaman Sea, where India has the islands in the Andaman Sea in between India and Myanmar. Yeah, there you go. In that area. The Indian Navy has been building up their patrol bases there so they can cut off China from critical resources in case of a war. So China in Power Center 4 is also integrating with the Caspian Sea countries, and therefore and trying to integrate with the Black Sea countries also. Mm-hmm. So if Russia and China integrate, it's a bigger integration than just the two countries. You really have an integration of the whole of Central Asia in the Heartland. So now if we move over to the fifth power center, no,
Oh, you mean like
stay on the
just
same
here? Yeah.
map. Yeah, stay on the same map. Yeah, there you go. So Japan is interesting because Russia is so resource rich that they have oil and gas fields all over the country. So they have tremendous oil and gas fields in the Far East that they can export out of Vladivostok. They just built a big pipeline over the past several years that goes from the Far East down to Beijing.
Okay. Seems we lost George. I guess we'll stop the recording here.